Telling a story is all about pacing, a rising action, building up to the climax, conflict and resolutions all have to happen in a proper order to feel right. Otherwise, things feel disjointed, often lead to confusion, and that's no different with the story of Telltale Games, where things happened a little too much, a little too early at different points. So we see here with the success of The Walking Dead is it became a gateway to new opportunities, but also became an anchor that kept them from innovating. It's so easy that when you find success to try to rest on those laurels, but at the same time there was no rest necessarily happening within this company. More games than ever were being put out. At one point there were 3 games done in a calendar year, 15 different episodes. That meant bringing in a larger amount of people who could execute the tasks. Also creating an environment that couldn't be sustainable with massive amounts of crunch. But instead of investing in the things that could have given them an opportunity to grow their IP, to develop relationships with people who were there for Telltale Games specifically, not necessarily the IPs that they represented. Instead, there was a madness in the security blanket that was making the same thing. This was already an aging technology and style when it began. The storytelling of Telltale Games was quality and immensely successful from beginning to finish. But what never changed was the ability to drive the engagement of those stories. When you don't change, things get stagnant and they die. In an era of entertainment, people expect growth. When you get more efficient at driving these things, the thing you do is not make more of the same thing. It's you fill in those blanks with better opportunity to create change and growth. So how do we find ourselves here? The people who are masters of stories, how did they trip over this? Well, first and foremost, it wasn't the people telling the stories that made this mistake. But a lot of it was driven by not planning for success. Too often we're driven by the things that we're most afraid of that are usually rooted in failures. But when we're caught up in these failures, we don't see the landscape ahead of us. We don't plan appropriately for when things go well. So we don't necessarily take stock of what works or doesn't. And I think we saw that with The Walking Dead hitting so big and with a great surprise, is all of a sudden this one game probably accounted for more revenue and a growth than all of the titles previously combined. Now, I'm spitballing that. I'm sure there's some numbers out there that can go there. But one way or another, this was a game-changing event for them. It allowed this chance to grow. But how do you grow appropriately when you don't necessarily know the thing that made you successful? What we see is you end up replicating exactly the same thing without the growth elements that allow for better engagement. Banking on the things that you hear from your audience without truly asking them. Are there moments where you're afraid to know, hey, we're glad you loved our game, but why do you love our game? What is it about this? The writers, I feel, got a lot of this in growing their storytelling throughout. I feel that was persistently on point, but where were the opportunities to invest in more infrastructure that can allow that stronger engagement to make people enjoy their games with greater regularity, to bring a replayability even in games that tend to not have that because they're so story-driven? Problems we find here is that when you're trying to produce too many games, but not necessarily always focused on making good games, that's one of the things we start to see when you're trying to do things too much. There is a law of diminishing returns. Even with the greatest of efforts and hours, there's only so much good that can be squeezed out of any one thing. When you drill a well, if you keep going to that well, eventually it will dry up. You have to keep investing in new growth. Now, this is problematic in a lot of ways because what we see is that a team that was used to building one game at a time was now, built upon in multitudes to build 2 to 3 things at once, sometimes even 4 as they overlap. So your best talent, your leaders, your approval processes get shaped around delivering more product instead of experiences that are worthy of release. Also, when you do that, you're too caught up in an iteration cycle to actually innovate. You just keep doing what works. And eventually what works stops working. The audiences grow and expect different things, the technology and changes that you're not keeping up with. And even more so, the inability to invest in things that are yours. I think that's one of the things when we look at the story of Telltale is the storyteller talk about characters that aren't theirs, and they do it masterfully. But how, with this glut of amazing writers and a team built around storytelling, how many of them may have had their own IP to pitch? Things that could have driven change within that company, give them a profit margin, a benefit to investing in your people, helping shape a narrative that is about growing talent within and betting on yourselves instead of only relying on the IPs that are already established. The question has been posed, and I find it quite interesting, is how many people are there for Telltale games versus the IP they represent? How many people did you get for Minecraft that were actual Minecraft gamers, or people who just loved seeing Telltale tell another story? So those same people have been there at a higher profit margin and even more interested in something that was shaped by the storytellers that were already there, and it was their own brand. Those are questions that we won't get answered. There were some points towards the end where we got to see that these things were on the roadmap, but we didn't get to see them come to fruition. The idea of going with the safer bet, the IP-driven game, the thing that you've already banked on, but also taking those chances to grow and invest in things that are yours. I think it's one of the struggles as a creative is where do you play it safe and where do you take risks? There's a benefit in dreaming and reaching for greater things, but you also have to root that with that level of reality. But if you only live in what's safe, you never innovate, you never have challenges. And what's a good story without a good challenge? There is nothing worth having in this world that doesn't come without work, conflict, and a challenge towards something better. And when you don't have those challenging moments, when they're all internalized and interpersonal versus creative, that's where the struggle continues. And that's what we saw with the story of Telltale Games, and why it's both an inspiration and a cautionary tale of creativity.